Coming up on Tech News Weekly, what's it like being a 10-year-old with a smartphone? Also, how to build a podcast on the blockchain, on-demand fuel delivery, and the demise of gas stations, and EU's record-breaking antitrust fine, and what that might mean for Google's Android. All that and more coming up next on Tech News Weekly.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Tech News Weekly is brought to you by Cashfly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Tech News Weekly, episode 41, recorded Thursday, July 19th, 2018. This episode of Tech News Weekly is brought to you by Slide Belts. High quality, comfortable ratchet belts that are easy to adjust. If you want a better belt, go to slidebelts.com/twit and use code TWIT for 20% off.
Welcome to Tech News Weekly. This is the show where we talk to the intrepid reporters making and sometimes breaking the news. I'm Megan Maroney.
And I'm Jason Howell. Sometimes breaking the age barriers of who are using technology. What is it like to be a 10-year-old in the modern age of smartphones and social media? I don't know. I'm not 10. So we invited Katie Notopoulos from Buzzfeed onto the show. She, too, is not 10, but she took up the challenge of pretending to be 10 in order to see what it's like being protected from all the things that 10-year-old users are protected from while using their iPhone. Welcome to the show, Katie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's great to get you here. So first and foremost, why 10 and what inspired you to travel down this mysterious road?
I should probably admit that the idea for it was like literally sort of brainstorming ideas here of like what would be a fun, dumb stunt to do. Like what could we do with a phone that is something that people haven't done before that's like learning a new experience of how we use it. I think it was one of my editors was like, what if we made it like a child phone? At 10, because I think that for me, that's the age where I think a lot of kids are getting their first phones, which is a lot younger than you might expect. I think a lot about teenagers on the internet and how they're using social media. That's a lot of what I write about. But 10 is younger. That's still really a child, but that's right around 6th grade. That's when a lot of parents are sort of making these decisions of like, okay, I want my kid to be able to call or text me when they need a ride home from school or, soccer practice, those kind of things. Like it's actually becomes really useful for them to have some sort of device. But it's still really scary because 10 is really young. And it's lower than what most of the services that we use on our phone, like social media, even email, what their age restrictions are, which are usually around 12 or 13.
So there's different layers here of this kind of experiment that you did. There's the roadblocks and the settings inside the phone itself. There's the apps that set their own age boundaries. I mean, maneuvering all of this stuff can be, I imagine, a nightmare in and of itself. Talk a little bit about some of these roadblocks and kind of the settings that you had to do in order to set yourself up to protect you from these things.
Yeah. Having the vague sense that parental controls exist on a phone, but having never encountered them as an adult on my phone, I literally had to Google how to set up child's phone. And there are many helpful tutorials out there that show you, it's sort of one of those things that's buried deep inside the iPhone settings of like where you can actually set up these options. And so once I sort of found that out, there's two main things you can do. One is you can set up a secondary iCloud account that is for a child that you manage through your own phone, which means they have to ask you for permission anytime they want to download an app or even, download a song from the iTunes store. And you get like a pop-up on your phone that says, approve or deny Junior's request to download, Facebook or whatever. The second thing is there is a screen where you can set up what's called restrictions. and the adult would create a unique passcode that's different but similar to the one that was a similar concept to what opens your phone to unlock it. But you set up a different code that presumably the child doesn't know, and then you can set up all these restrictions about whether or not music with explicit lyrics can be downloaded or listened to on iTunes streaming. What age level of apps they're allowed to download, whether or not there's website restrictions. There's, sort of basic settings for, no adult content, or you can block specific websites. Like you could block YouTube or block, whatever else you might want to block. So I went into those restrictions on my own phone. I set them up so that anything that was like an app for age 12 plus, I could have 9 plus. But most apps seem to be either 4 plus, like really basic, or 12 plus. So I was about half the apps on my phone immediately disappeared as soon as I did this. I will warn anyone who wants to try this that when they're not deleted, you can, as soon as you turn off the restrictions, they pop right back. But if you have carefully organized into folders all your apps, they will come completely unfoldered back on, and it'll be like a giant mess on your phone. So just a word of caution if you want to try this experiment.
I found that when I first tried to install a little more involved parental controls on my kids' phones, there was something that hopefully you're not going to need this now with iOS 12, which we should say you didn't try this on iOS 12. But yeah, the first thing it did was mess up all my kids' app folders, and so it was not. It was
so
not
right out of the gate, you were an enemy.
They were like, I do not like Big Brother at all. Stop it.
Right.
So you call this like an imperfect and subjective system. In many ways, it seems really broken. You point out that the CNN app is 12 plus, but the Fox app is 4 plus. And it's not necessarily like a conservative or liberal thing, because the Wall Street Journal was also 4 plus. So talk a little bit about what's going on with these age restrictions on the news apps.
So I should clarify that both Fox and Wall Street Journal have since changed they're all 12 plus now. But yeah, I mean, what I found was that the age ratings, which end up, I think most of the time we sort of barely look at, but if you use these restrictions, they become incredibly important because it matters what apps you can actually access or not. It's a really weird rating system, and it doesn't always seem to huge logic or reason. So, one of the things I know is I have a lot of news apps on my phone. So all the basic things like Buzzfeed News, New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, all of these news apps were rated 12 plus, and except for Fox News and Wall Street Journal, which were 4 plus, which, logically makes no sense. There's nothing actually different in the news that appears in these apps. And I don't think that Apple is in the business of making age ratings based on, political slant. So, I mean, in those cases, I reached out to both of them. They didn't really know the answer of why it was. To get an age rating when you're an app, you fill out this pretty basic questionnaire that just asks you what kind of adult content you have in the app, whether it's violence or nudity, or even things that really seem to be targeted towards video games. Like, is there simulated gambling, like a blackjack game? Is there, cartoon violence or horror? And those things are not necessarily relevant for, say, a news app, or even something like Twitter that's a popular app, or even like a Spotify, right? It's sort of questionable what the content is there. And there's all sorts of weird things, like anything that has unfiltered access to the internet is rated 17 plus. So Chrome is 17 plus. So you can have Safari and do whatever you want. If you want to have Chrome, 17 plus. And then even because of that, there's even weirder things like my password manager. I use Dashlane as a password manager, but there's internet access, or sort of a browser access within Dashlane, which means it's 17 plus. Which makes no sense. And then there's other things that are completely, useless to a child under 12, but are rated 4 plus, like the American Express app, which it actually, in the American Express terms of service, to use the app, you have to be 18 plus. So, you can download the app but not use it as a 5-year-old. So things like that don't make sense. Twitter is rated 17 plus because nudity and swear words are not filtered. Facebook and Instagram are 12 plus because they are filtered. But the reality is a lot of teenagers are on Twitter and you only have to be 13 to join. So there's things that don't line up in terms of what a parent or what society typically allows a teenager to do versus what the App Store thinks.
Interesting. Right now, technology is so driven by this social media, social network kind of thread, through our lives it is. And of course, that extends to our children who may or may not be of age to qualify to use those services. From your perspective, I mean, you've obviously been using social media for, a decent amount of time now, I would imagine. So you're very used to it being, there and present in your life. Going to this new perspective of a 10-year-old not having the ability to use these things for a while, was that a nice, was that a nice break, or did you learn anything about kind of your own social media habits, suddenly not being able to use them?
So I continued to use them on my computer. I needed these things to actually do my job function at work. So I just did it on my phone. So it was sort of nights and weekends. And basically what it meant is I can't access email. I'm under 13. I don't have to work at night.
Man, we need to do this here. This is great.
Of a cop-out to not having to do nights and weekends being always on, which I think a lot of adults in this day are. I found myself, I played a lot of solitaire. That was like the game that was a 4+ app that I spent a lot of time on. For me, it was a nice break. It was like a relaxing time. But in a way, I still was on my phone constantly. So I think that the big thing about the age ratings is they're kind of nonsensical. And I don't know how a parent of a 10-year-old is going to decide how to use these to navigate what their kid can or cannot use. I think it's probably really difficult for them to do that if they can even figure out where those settings lie, because it's also not that obvious and easy. And I talked to a bunch of parents who were like, I didn't know you could actually set that up. And parents I talked to had figured out a lot of ways around this. So I talked to one parent who shared an iPad with her 9-year-old, and what she would do is she would check at the end of the day the browser history and look at everything that he had used, and so he knew mom's watching. I better not do anything weird. I talked to another parent who she wanted her kid to be able to be in touch for emergency situations, so she just got him a flip phone, which is pretty smart, I think, in a way. It's, he can, call and text, but he can't look at YouTube, basically. So parents are sort of figuring out different ways around these problems. And I do think the screen time feature, which will be on the newest iOS 12, that's the feature that will, you can either set time limits for certain apps. So you can say you can only use 30 minutes of Instagram a day. Or you can also get basically a readout report of all your daily usage. Parents I talk to are really excited about this. They think that this is going to be a game changer for how to easily manage this. So one good thing about looking at this is you can tell all of a sudden, hey, is my kid using their phone, texting after 11 p.m. when they're supposed to be in bed? Are they looking at YouTube during school hours? Are they spending 6 hours a day on YouTube watching stuff? So I think that actually the issue of overall screen time and consumption, I think ends up being kind of more important to a lot of parents rather than what specific apps should or should not they be allowed to use. So I do think that this feature is going to be really good for parents.
Awesome. Something to look forward to. Katie Notopoulos from Buzzfeed, we really appreciate you taking one for the team and being the 10-year-old in this situation to let us know how it is. We'll talk to you soon, Katie. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
This week, the nonprofit software company Civil announced that you can register to buy a form of cryptocurrency called Civil tokens that will be available for an August 13th offering. If you have no idea what that means, you might want to subscribe to the new Zigzag podcast, which is working with Civil, partly supported by Civil, and explains how Civil and the blockchain work, while also somehow changing the course of journalism, capitalism, and women's lives, plus solving the problem of hot sauce trolls. Our next guest is here to talk about how she is building her podcast on the blockchain. Welcome, Manoush Zomorodi.
Oh, it's so great to be back, Megan. I've missed you so thank you for having me. God, you just made my podcast sound like a mush.
Well, you can clear that. You can clear that up for us. So, like you said, we've spoken a few times. You used to host the Note to Self podcast. Now you've gone out on your own, which means I get to talk to you directly to book this. You don't have a special assistant anymore,
Me.
which is one of the differences.
Better or worse.
Tell us a little bit. Give your better elevator pitch of Zigzag.
So my executive producer of the podcast that you mentioned, Note to Self, she and I were thinking it was time to go out on our own for lots of reasons. And we ended up talking to some folks over at Civil, which is, as you mentioned, a startup that is using blockchain to try and create an ecosystem, a decentralized ecosystem for journalism, where advertising money is not the point. People aren't having to go for clicks. They're not having to go through Mark Zuckerberg to get people's eyeballs. The idea is that, can we find investigative local news and give them a place to flourish? Now, how do you pay for all that to begin with? Well, that's where Consensus, which is founded by Joe Lubin, he's one of the co-creators of the Ethereum blockchain. He has created this place, Consensus, where they are funding a bunch of projects, one of which is Civil. And so we were talking to them and they said, we think you might actually be a good fit for this weird project that we're developing. We can give you a grant to get started. What do you want to cover? And we said, well, actually, we want to cover you, because this is the weirdest project we have ever heard of. And being part of it is kind of a weird meta mashup for us, where we are actually documenting in real time as this startup gets up and running and essentially tries to convince mainstream America that they should get on the blockchain, which is no easy task.
I love you go through and ask people, just regular people, what they think of it. And it's just what you'd expect. Like, I know what a block is and I know what chains are. And you do some great metaphors. I mentioned the hot sauce trolls, and hot sauce is one of the ways you explain what the blockchain is and how it works. You also use a guy who sings a little song, which I still can't get out of my head weeks later.
Earworm, I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
Do you want to give a little explanation of what the blockchain is in terms of hot sauce?
Well, I think that your listeners probably know that blockchain is a technology that makes Bitcoin work. But actually, most people don't realize that Bitcoin and blockchain are related. So we have to just start with the real basics. And then talking about, that blockchain is this idea of a string of computers, a necklace of computers that are all sharing information. And there are various blockchains all around. For some reason, most people say on the blockchain, which is like being on Sesame Street. I'm not really sure why that has happened, but so we have to sort of explain that. But the hot sauce thing that you're talking, that's the intermediate version of blockchain. We got really hot and heavy into TCRs. So those of you who don't know what a TCR is, that's okay. It's a token curated registry. And that's the idea of creating a mini economy, right? Where there's a cryptocurrency at the heart of it, where people don't have to use, again, ad dollars, right? What they're trying to get people to do, and what they announced yesterday, was that if you buy a Civil token, you then become sort of a player, a donator, a patron in this ecosystem for news. And you can do lots of different things with that token. You can do micro tipping eventually. You can vote to make sure that real good journalism is on the platform. You can also vote to get bad journalism off the platform. Or you can also stake your tokens and start your own website, your own mini media empire. I should clarify, though, I am not a spokesperson for Civil. I am not sure this is going to work. Full stop. But what I do think is very interesting about it, as someone who has really been on this like tech and ethics beat, this is the dawn of a new technology. Imagine if we had had this conversation with consumers when the internet started. Maybe we wouldn't be in the, I was going to say a bad word, fest that we're in right now. I mean, I think there needs to be a new conversation between technologists and consumers so that we build the tech that we really want. And that's what I saw as a sort of narrative opportunity with Civil.
Yeah, and opportunity being the key word. I feel like blockchain as an idea, as a concept, is very, like you said, very misunderstood. People have a hard time really understanding what blockchain even means. And yet it's entirely possible that 10 years from now, the concept of blockchain and everything that's built around it will seem as normal as the internet does now. When the internet first came out, a lot of people were scratching their heads because they just didn't quite understand it, right? We're at that beginning, that kind of inflection point where this new technology may be confusing, but there's tons of opportunity there. So it's awesome to be in a position where you can kind of put your money or your coin where your mouth is, but that also comes with a lot of risk, right? You mentioned that your operating budget is kind of half actual money and half waiting for Civil coins to sell. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the grant that we got from Civil was half normal money and half tokens. And so that meant that we didn't know what that token amount was going to be. And did we have visions of Lamborghinis in our minds? Maybe a little bit, or at least enough that we could hire a couple people, right, to get our business off the ground. But yesterday in their announcement, Civil spelled out very specifically the parameters around the sale of the token, and they are extremely strict and conservative. And my impression is that the reason why they are so strict and conservative is because they don't want to be lumped in with the hundreds of ICOs that are fraudulent or preying on people who are maybe placing too much of their own money down, betting that this might be a get-rich scheme, that they certainly don't want to be regulated as a security. Like, there's a real deep belief in the people making this stuff that this is a way to create a utility. This is about creating an ecosystem for journalism. So how do you do that? You have the hard cap for the token sale is very modest. They are not looking to make a ton of money. What they want is to play the long game and see if they can make this thing fly. There's also an arduous task that you have to go through in order to register for these tokens. They do not want people just being like, let's see if we can get rich. You have to take a quiz, which I failed. So as someone who actually has been immersed in this, I failed because I didn't know the difference between a hot and cold wallet. Do you guys know the difference between a hot and cold?
I didn't even know.
Totally new tab.
I didn't even know there were hardware wallets. There was such a thing as hardware wallets till I listened to your podcast about hardware wallets.
It's a whole new world. And so I think that's why we're kind of the perfect proxy, because this is not easy stuff, but that's what their whole point is. They want people who are going to care very deeply about getting this thing off the ground. And if you can't sort of put in the time, they don't want your money either, which is admirable. But what if there aren't enough people who come and buy the tokens? That's my concern.
So if I believe that journalism is in a scary place right now, and I've believed for a long time that journalists need to be paid more, and it's and there needs to be a way for good and honest media to survive. Is that why? And I figure out what a hot and cold wallet is. Is that why I would invest? But would I also invest because I think maybe I believe in that, and also it could be a way that I could put my kids through college?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Not the last part. The first part, absolutely. Okay. You are maybe not happy about certain heads of state yelling at members of the press and calling them fake. You don't necessarily think that that Facebook, the duopoly as they're often referred to, should be the ones deciding how and where we get our news. And maybe you miss the fact that there was a local newspaper in your community and there isn't one anymore. And somebody needs to be keeping track of what the politicians are up to. So that would be the reasons why you would want to do it. And look, if you decide the token thing is not your bag, it's cool. Like not everybody goes on Wikipedia and wants to update the essays and the information on there, right? Some people just go to read, and that's fine too. So I think the hope is that a regular person might say, you know what, I do care about news and journalism. It's a fundamental pillar of democracy, and I feel a little bit empowered to do something about it. So maybe I'll put down $100 and see what this civil thing's about, and at least show my support and also educate myself and maybe learn about this blockchain thing. They are, by the way, going to be offering free webinars and having a free hotline. So they really are working hard to be one of the most effective or I guess accessible consumer-facing blockchains ever. So there's free education here too. So I think it's a good, worthy experiment.
So you would compare this maybe to something like, subscribing to like a newspaper online, even though you could get it free, but not the same as like changing everything in your IRA to like a socially conscious fund. Like you wouldn't compare it to that. Like don't go in this with your life savings.
Well, they won't let you. The protections that they have in place, they are being so cautious about making sure that this is there's a consumer protection element to this that's not even an option. They won't take your money. So I would say contribute or buy some tokens because you're curious, because you believe in good journalism, because you want to learn something, and because maybe you want to make sure that if there's one thing you can do, it's put a little bit of money where your mouth is, that you care about these things. But I think those are really good reasons to be part of it. It's why I've decided to be part of it. And I hope, playing the long game pays off, not in money.
But that wouldn't hurt.
Yeah.
Well, sure. I mean, that'd be great. Like right now, there's 2 of us in this little office.
Yeah.
I mean, like, that would be nice to add a couple of people for sure.
Absolutely.
I have to get a Lambo. It's fine.
Well, we haven't even really talked about the podcast, which is good because talking about a podcast is not as good as listening to the actual podcast.
Sure.
So I love that you're halfway through episode 7, dropped today. Go to Apple Podcasts, subscribe to it, go to wherever you get your podcast. It's Zigzag Pod, and definitely listen. You guys, I loved your episode 5, Men, Women, and Vulnerability, where you talked to Alex Bloomberg, who did a similar experiment, leaving his job and starting Gimlet Media. And so, yeah, it's interesting to see whether gender really changes the story there. So,
what do you think, Megan? Does it?
Yeah, of course. Gender always changes the story.
Yeah,
I think.
Yes.
Not necessarily, either way. It's just not. It affects it in one way or the other. Like technology, it's affecting.
Neither good, not neutral ever.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Manoush, thank you so much. You can find Manoush at Manoush Z on Twitter. And where's the Zigzag Pod the best place to send people?
Yeah, or like you said, wherever you listen to podcasts, search for Zigzag. Take a listen. We'd love to hear from you, and join this fun community that cares about journalism.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Manoush.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you both. Cool. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Best of luck. Up next, a number of companies are looking to revolutionize how we get gas into our gas guzzlers. But first, this episode of Tech News Weekly is brought to you by Slide Belts. High quality, comfortable ratchet belts that are easy to adjust. Personally, I love a good belt. I'm a big belt wearer, but it has to look good, it has to fit well, it has to sit right. And Slide Belts go one step further. They ratchet into place. It's super satisfying. It's like, and it's tight and it fits perfect. Obviously, belt isn't something that you think about too often. You put it on, you go about your business. Usually just when you hit that last hole on the strap, you kind of have to struggle to kind of make it fit. And, you've got those predetermined holes that you can snap it to, but anywhere in between, it's not going to work. Well, Slide Belts don't have holes like your old belt. Instead, they use this patented ratchet design, which actually, this is my belt right here.
Ratchet it up.
Ratchet it up. So you pull that and you can undo it. Right, there's the buckle. You drop it in. And as you pull it, You get that, kind of snaps into place, super satisfying because you get like the perfect snug fit. 32 adjustment options, so much more comfortable than any of the belts that I've worn because it always fits the right way. Such an improvement over the traditional belt. You can easily remove the buckle. You can mix and match. Here's another one here. Oh, what do you know? There's a Twit logo on the front of it. You can mix and match with other straps for ultimate customization and versatility, which is very nice in a good belt. You want to be able to kind of swap things out and mix them up. Slide belts offer a wide selection of straps from full grain and top grain leathers to high quality canvas and animal friendly vegan. Slide belts can be worn casually around the house and at the office or, for date night. It's a great travel belt as well. Slide belts are easy to take off and put on while going through security. And if you're still not convinced, Slide Belts offers a 1-year warranty, free exchanges, and no hassle returns. If you really want to go for it, by the way, they have the survival belt, which literally, it's a survival belt. There's a knife, there's a fire starter, you can do all sorts of flashlight. It's more than just a belt, obviously.
They have
this thing's going to save your life.
They have them for ladies too, even the survival belt.
When can you ever say that a belt might save your life? Here you go. If you're ready for a better belt, go to slidebelts.com/twit. Make sure and use the code TWIT at checkout. And if you do that, you're going to receive 20% off your order. That's slidebelts.com/twit. Don't forget to use code TWIT for 20% off your order. And we thank Slide Belts for their support. I'm going to wait until after the show to put mine back on. I don't want to distract you with the ratchet system during this next interview, Megan.
Thanks. Since 1994, 25% of America's gas stations have disappeared, mostly due to gentrification and rising property values. Enter on-demand fuel companies, and we could see gas stations begin to disappear at an even faster rate. Joining us to talk about tech's impact on ye old gas station is former gas station cashier Gavin Jenkins, who is also a freelance writer for the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Outline, and others. Welcome to the show, Gavin.
Thank you for having me on.
So earlier this year, I had a chance to try out one of these on-demand fuel services, Filled. It seemed ridiculous when I heard about it at first, but once I tried it, I really appreciated the convenience of it. It's not in our area yet, so I couldn't say if I would be a regular customer or not. But start by telling us what you've learned about the various on-demand fuel options out there.
Oh, well, they all vary in different ways. You had Filled, you said? Mm-hmm. Filled is, they're moving along slowly. They're only in a few cities, Portland, Seattle, Vancouver, and the San Francisco Bay Area. And they try to not fill up during peak hours. So they'll even do night fill-ups. The other two main ones are Yoshi and Booster. Not Booster. Is it Booster? I'm blanking right now. But Yoshi is in 14 cities, and they'll do any time of day. They're having trouble. All three of them are having trouble getting individual customers, and they're not profiting from that yet. So they're relying on fleets and having memberships through where you work.
So what I had a hard time understanding was, I understand you don't want to get up off the couch, you want food delivered, you don't, want to go into a store, you want your sneakers delivered, but you're already in your car, so why not just stop at a gas station? But I guess there are people who really find this convenience something that they're willing to pay a premium for.
Yeah, the one of the people I talked to was a doctor, and her husband was also a doctor, and together they each worked up to 80 hours a week, and they had 2 daughters. So she told me that they have everything delivered to their house, Amazon, groceries, and gasoline, and just 10 minutes a week, cut that out of her schedule. It's 10 more weeks with her, or 10 more minutes with her daughters. Mm-hmm. But what I found interesting is that along with the convenience, I heard gripes about just going to the gas station, that they're too busy. There's traffic within the lot. A lot of people complain about just touching gas pump handles, which I find fascinating. So, but another thing is, because gas stations are disappearing, sometimes they're not on your route to go home. So if you're in a busy city going 3 or 4 blocks out of your way on your route home to go to a gas station can turn into an extra half hour sometimes just because of the traffic. And some people are willing to pay for that convenience. And another thing that is fascinating is the danger aspect. When I talked to Phil and Yoshi, they said that a little over a majority of their customers were women. And they all 3 of them promote it as a safer option than going to gas stations.
Interesting.
Did you see my dog in the,
yes.
in the background?
Yeah.
Yes, we saw the dog. The dog selfie is now on the record. So obviously people are paying extra for this, right? Like what kind of premium are they paying in order for this convenience?
Well, each one is different. Oh my God.
Excellent. Welcome back, dog.
This is Bob, everybody.
Perfect.
Bob thinks that your hair tastes wonderful.
Yeah, he loves to lick my hair. They all cost different. So Yoshi has a membership fee. It's the only one that has a membership fee, and it's $20 a month, plus the price of gas. And their price of gas is the AAA average in the region. And they also have a whole lot of other options that they have. Like you can get an oil change, you can get your car washed, and your wiper blades changed, air in your tires. And if you aren't a member for Yoshi, it's $7. For Filled, they don't have a membership, so it's between $3 and $9, depending on where you live and what time of day. So if you're close to where their cars are, I would imagine, plus if you do it at night, it would probably be cheaper. Booster, which was the other company, their package is all based, like, it's through an employer. So I believe it's the employer in some situations pays for it. With Yoshi, when it's through the employer, it's like a discount, but you're still paying for the price of gas. That's one of the things that I found so outrageous about it when I first heard about it a few years ago.
Yeah, well, it sounds like in one case, it sounds like you're paying the flat monthly fee. That's probably good for someone who fills up a lot, right? Because the more times you fill up throughout the course of a month, welcome back, dog. The more times you fill up through the course of a month, really the better value that you're getting out of that versus these other that pay per visit. So that probably dictates what kind of customers they end up getting, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it doesn't make sense if you only use your car like once a week. But if you're driving, if you have like an hour commute to your job, and you fill up a couple times a week, then it would probably work out for you. You might, in some aspects, if you use it enough, if you're constantly driving, it may even pay for itself. You may even save money. Like if you're an Uber driver or a pizza delivery guy, I think somewhere down the line with Yoshi, if you are getting the membership fee, and you're getting that average, you depending on how often you fill up, it might even be the better option.
So you also point out in your piece that this one of the many ways that tech disrupts our lives. This might lead to making one of the places that many types of different people interact with each other, making that disappear. You worked at a gas station, and you said you saw a lot of interactions. There was a doctor, and then there was a waiter, and someone else next. But I mean, my experience with gas stations is I don't go in anymore. I usually just pay at the pump. So is that the kind of interactions, like, waving to the person in front of me to get out of the way so I can go?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually one of the things that fascinated me about on-demand fuel is that people, you can just take it out, that aspect out of your life. And I think that a lot of people do what you do. They just want to pull up to the pump, pay with their card, and zip out of there. But I think the NACS on one of on its websites, which I linked to my article for the outline, it shows that about 45 or 48% of people still do go into stores, but if when you're missing at the gas stations to me are amazing places where you get all walks of life. And whenever I was working there, it was sort of like Orange is the New Black meets Cheers. Like, it was just all these weird, strange characters that would never meet anywhere else. And so many of them were regulars. But upper class people, if they want to choose not to go to the gas station anymore, this is their opportunity too, along with electric vehicles. Mm-hmm. And what is that going to do to society? That's what I ended with. The question. That's what I ended the article asking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that it will just be a place for just a certain, just the poor.
Right, and I think to a certain degree, maybe it is. I mean, you have to look what's going on in society right now. I mean, is Starbucks a place for poor people? You have African Americans are getting the cops called on them if they go into Starbucks. That happened earlier in the year. So the flip side of that is, are gas stations already spaces that are working class spaces in the inner city where, there are a lot of people who just want to pull up, pay with their card at the pump and then bail. They don't want to go inside and get a cup of coffee. And
you point out also that a lot of these companies, these on-demand fuel companies, are saying, they're using so-called danger at the gas station as a reason for you to do this. When you actually looked at the crime statistics, they were inaccurate, what they were saying.
Right. That was one of the things that was fascinating to me. Since I started working at a gas station in the spring of 2015. And when I did, I set up a Google alert for gas stations. And every day, and I still have it, and every single day I get an email filled with news from around the country. And there's constantly stories of robbery and stabbings and shootings and skimmers. And that's another thing, is there's a lot of skimmer con artists out there. And from the emails that I get every day, you would think that there's an epidemic of just danger at the gas stations. But when you look at the FBI's crime stats, it's like 1%. It's nothing. You're more likely to get robbed in your own home. Yoshi corrected its mistake. Yoshi had the incorrect stat, and they didn't even know where they got it from. I would suspect that they just got it from Booster's website. But Phil does another route. They have the Justice Department, the Justice Department has a crime survey which incorporates unreported crimes, and it's still not even. It's still just a fraction of the violent crimes. So. But that's not to say some gas stations aren't dangerous. There are some gas stations in the inner city that might be dangerous, especially at certain times of night. My gas station where I worked was 24 hours, and I know people that told me that they wouldn't go there at a certain hour, even with all the security cameras and the security guard. And when you have a city or you have a gas station that's in an area that's gentrified, that's just leading to more segregation. Mm.
Yeah, it's a good point, because I do get, I usually pay at the pump, but then every winter, my family and I, we always drive to Montana from Northern California. And part of what I love is usually my husband gets the gas and I go in to buy some, food that I don't need. And it's just like going through Nevada and, Montana and all these different places, Idaho. It is just a kind of an eye into what that area is like, something that I don't see in my little Sonoma County bubble here. So it would be sad if those places disappeared.
It would be sad, and also if you just look at how one of the things I was happy about with that article was that I was able to spell out the evolution of gas stations, and they started out as we had to have them because of the upper class was starting to buy cars. And So they started out as these, if you think about it, these public displays of your wealth. And then they became ubiquitous after World War II, and the middle class started to buy cars in droves. And, and they used to be car-centric. My dad grew up in the 50s and the 60s, and he used to hang out at a gas station. And whenever he hung out at gas stations, he hung out in the garages and he learned how to fix cars. Well, whenever I was a teenager, they were slowly turning into what they are today, is just like a mix of McDonald's, Exxon, and 7-Eleven. You have these giant convenience stores that have fast food, and you can get every legal vice in one place. You can get alcohol, tobacco, lottery tickets, fried foods, junk foods. And it's basically just gas stations have become where all of our vices are in one spot.
It would be sad for those vice homes
outlets
of vices to disappear.
Well, they wouldn't disappear. I mean, the gas station chains wouldn't disappear. They're trying to find ways to evolve in a way to still bring in the customers. And so that's why a couple years ago, the New York Times had a piece about artisanal food, like Thai food restaurants at gas stations. And so last year, the Wall Street Journal had a piece about how gas stations in the future will have retail. So basically, they're going to turn into mini malls. They'll have a food court, they'll have retail and a convenience store, and you can charge up your electric car outside. Gas stations won't disappear. They're just going to evolve into something else. A really great quote by Frank Lloyd Wright is that gas stations are the city in embryo, and that they, if I could paraphrase, is that they will change into whatever the city needs. And so gas stations your convenience store gas station isn't going to go away. It's just going to continue to evolve.
Well, Gavin, thank you so much. You're working on a book about gas stations, is that correct?
Trying to. Working on a book is really hard.
Yeah, so I've heard. Thank you so much for coming on. Gavin Jenkins is a writer.
Thank you.
He's a writer. He's a dog lover, obviously, and can be found on Twitter at Gavin Jenkins80. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Gavin. EU regulators issued their long-anticipated fine to Google for what it says was an abuse of its market dominance via Android. 4.3 billion. Was it 4.3 billion euros? I missed the figure there, but translated, I know that, and it's $5 billion. That's a record-breaking fine for breaking antitrust laws. Joining us to talk about this is author of the Android Intelligence column and newsletter and longtime friend of All About Android, JR Raphael. Welcome back, JR.
Hey, Jason. Hey, Megan. How are you guys?
Good. How are you?
Doing
good.
Awesome.
Good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you, man. It's been a while. So first, tell us a little bit about the specifics of what the EU has ruled that Google is guilty of. I know we've talked about it in the past, but it's good to do a little bit of a recap.
Yeah, it's one of these long, kind of convoluted, drawn out announcements. But the gist of it is there are a few main parts that are most significant. What they're saying is that Google has been forcing Android device makers to preload Chrome and its Google search. They call it the Google Search app. It's actually just basically the Google app nowadays onto phones. And that's part of what they call the GMS agreement. It's an agreement where anyone can use Android, the open source operating system, but to use it with Google services, the way most of us think of the Android experience that you're going to get on a Samsung phone, a Pixel phone, an LG phone, most devices you're going to buy, certainly here in the US in particular and in Europe, the device makers agree to certain terms. And one of them is that they will load a handful of Google apps that include those two, along with Gmail, Docs, all the standard stuff. And the EU says that by doing that, Google is making it too difficult for other companies that might provide a browser or search appliance to gain market share. And then there's another piece of it, too, that Google is preventing its partners from developing devices based on forks of Android. So what they're talking about there is kind of like what Amazon does with the Fire tablets. They took that open source code without the Google services layer And they built their entire own operating system that you kind of don't even know is Android. They don't call it Android. They just took the open source code and built their own thing. So if I'm HTC, I couldn't go do that same thing and then also sell a phone based on Google's Android. And that you alleges there that Google is unfairly restricting those companies in that way. And, they should be able to sell an Android phone with Google services and also sell, their own fork of Android, or sell, say, an Amazon device if Amazon were to allow third-party manufacturers or that kind of thing.
Okay, so the lack of a choice of both, being able to do both simultaneously, is at least part of this, anyways. So what is Google required to do aside from liquidating just one of its many beds of money?
Yeah, I'll just put out a few shekels. Actually, I read I read somewhere, and I can't confirm this personally, but that the fine, the $5 billion fine, is something like 2 weeks of revenue for Google. So all things in perspective, it is a record-breaking fine, and $5 billion to schmoes like us is obviously a lot of money, but to Google, it's not the end of the world.
They're going to have to hunker down for half a month.
Right. It's going to change the way of life there. No free desserts for
no
one Tuesday of the month.
Right.
Yeah. But no, I mean, the bigger, potentially more problematic thing for Google is that they're also being required to change the way they do these things. The EU is saying, stop, don't, you can't force manufacturers to preload Chrome and Google search onto devices as part of your agreement, and you can't prevent them from, selling devices with their own forks or other forks of Android in addition to it. Spoons are still okay, I'm told. Don't know about knives.
Yeah.
We'll have to take it day by day.
All right.
In your article, you basically say that the EU's assessment doesn't add up to what is the reality of how Android really works. Give us an example of what they say and what really is how people use Android.
Well, the two parts I was talking about most specifically there were the bundling of Chrome and the bundling of Google search. The fork part is a whole other can of worms. And I mean, I think there is an argument that perhaps it's a little unreasonable of Google to restrict manufacturers in that way. But as far as the Chrome bundling, the EU specifically said that bundling Chrome and search has reduced the incentives of manufacturers to pre-install competing apps, as well as the incentives of users to download alternate browsers. And, you start looking at this and then you realize that the biggest example that I pointed out is that Samsung, which is the world's biggest phone manufacturer, certainly Android manufacturer too, but even more than that, it pre-installs its own browser called Samsung Internet on all of its Google Android devices. And yes, Chrome is there too, presumably as part of that agreement. It does have to preload that. But when you power up a Galaxy S8, a Galaxy S9, a Galaxy Note, whatever phone you're looking at, Samsung Internet is actually usually the more prominent browser that you see. It typically has a spot right in the middle of, the dock of icons at the bottom of the home screen. It is often set to be the default browser for opening links from third-party apps. And, I pulled up and it had a screenshot of the Galaxy S9 user manual. It described it as the main browser. They're really presenting that as the phone's browser. And yeah, Chrome's also there too, of course. But that seems directly at odds with what the EU is alleging there, that it's discouraging manufacturers from preloading. And Samsung's not the only example, but it's certainly the biggest, and that's a pretty meaty example. And then talking about the incentives for users to download other browsers, you look in the Play Store and let's see, like Firefox has more than 100 million downloads, Opera and Opera Mini are 100 million apiece. The Samsung browser itself, which is in the Play Store, has 500 million, and the list goes on and on. So it just seems like there's a little bit of a disconnect with what they're saying and what actually happens in the real world. It's not to say that there might not be some middle ground where Google could give a little bit and maybe make it more obvious to users that there's a choice, because certainly not everybody's going to know that. But it doesn't quite seem as cut and dry as their statement makes it out to be.
Yeah, the direct example that comes to mind, I think, for a lot of people who have been following tech long enough, think of Microsoft and its kind of Windows, very similar situation here, where the solution ended up being, if I remember correctly, when you ran Windows for the first time, it would give you kind of a screen in the setup that would give you a number of different browsers, and it would say, which one of these do you want to load? And I don't know if the behavior on Windows. I haven't set up a Windows install in a really long time. I don't know if the behavior still does that, or Burke's shaking his head no. So apparently we've moved on. Maybe we have or have not learned our lesson. But do you think that's what we're going to see here? Is in Android setup something we don't do very frequently, I might add. People usually do this once and they move on with their lives. But are we going to see all these options of like, okay, well, here's a bunch of search options. Now here's a bunch of browser options, and go from there?
I think the first thing to remember is that Google's already said, as you would imagine, it's appealing this. So we'll see. There may or may not be any immediate impact. You've got to think any appeal would take probably years, and it's not clear if Google would still have to make changes immediately. So we'll see if and when anything does happen and how it plays out. The EU explicitly said, we're not going to force Google to do any one particular solution to this. We're going to leave it in Google's hands to come up with the answer. So it's still pretty much up in the air as to how any fix could be implemented. The one thing from my reading of it, and I'm obviously not a lawyer, but they didn't seem to. They seem to be pretty clear about the fact that the preloading of Chrome and Google search, that forcing manufacturers to preload it as part of their agreement was a no-no. So I don't know for sure that just giving some kind of prompt would be enough. What they might have to do if they were to go that route is to not preload it and then have some kind of prompt. Would you like to download Chrome? Would you like to use Samsung Internet? Would you like to find something else? And that was one thing I pointed out, that I don't know that that making that choice a little more apparent would necessarily be a bad thing. If just as part of that one-time setup at the first time you power on a new Android device to say, your device ships with Chrome and with Samsung Internet. Would you like to use A, B, or browse the Play Store for more options such as C, D, and E? I don't know that that would be a bad thing, but I think if we were to go the full extreme and not preload something like Chrome or the Google app, which also controls Google Assistant and a number of other things, then you're going to start getting some murky territory about how that's going to affect the user experience and consistency across the platform. And that seems to be more what the EU is getting at, that you shouldn't be forcing manufacturers to do this. That being said, of course, we could say you're not going to force manufacturers to do it, and they might still do it anyway. We don't know how it all play out.
So Android lets you decide which browser you're going to open links in third-party apps, and you said this is, that's a lot more than we can say for certain other mobile platforms. For example, why don't,
not naming any names?
why isn't that a problem? Is it just the way that Android is set up? And Blake in our chat room points out that when the default browser on a Samsung phone is and a Huawei phone is the Samsung browser, like why aren't they getting in trouble for that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, there are lots of points here. I know as far as iOS specifically, I think they consider that to be a slightly different territory because their market share is smaller. They're not licensing iOS out to other third-party manufacturers. Only Apple's making the phones. Whether that's right or not, that's a judgment call, but I guess that's the rationalization for it. But yeah, even with an Android, the inconsistency was just kind of baffling. And like you said, there are manufacturers that can ship their default browser, their own self-made default browser, as being the, out of the box default option for opening links. And if you don't want to use that, it's pretty easy to change. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of gray area, and you wonder if they maybe didn't know the finer points or just kind of chose to disregard them. It's hard to say, but it definitely doesn't all seem to add up with the reality of it.
Yeah. And then somewhat conveniently timed, it seems like. I'm kind of thinking that this was an intentional leak today to kind of distract a little bit from what's going on. But we heard a little bit more on Bloomberg. Mark Gurman reported about the Fuchsia operating system, which over the course of the last couple of years is this very elusive OS that, time and time again, the story ends up coming back around to, is this the ultimate replacement for Android and possibly Chrome OS? Is this, is this what we're looking at? And Google hasn't really said very much about what the long-term plan is on this, but there's new information that points that they've devoted a lot of people to this team. You wrote about this back in, I think it was May, sorry. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on Fuchsia and if any of the new news kind of changes your thinking.
Well, it's all really interesting, and it's also so mysterious. And like you said, Google seems to be deliberately mysterious. I saw they even responded to today's Bloomberg report with, kind of their standard line about it's an experimental project in Google, and it could go in any number of directions, and there's no firm roadmap. But yeah, the Bloomberg story definitely adds some details to it, all coming from, you know, the usual unnamed people familiar with the project. And like you said, the timing is a little curious that this comes out the day after the EU ruling. But, you know, I just keep thinking back every time I read about Fuchsia to what we heard for years about the inevitable merger of Android and Chrome OS. For years, that was the narrative. And we heard it from people with knowledge of the matter, you know, the unnamed sources. And everybody treated it like a foregone conclusion that Android and Chrome OS were going to be merged into one thing, that Chrome OS itself would basically be phased out, that it was going away. And, you know, in reality, who knows what happened behind the scenes, how many things were actually considered, how many projects were underway that shifted. But in the end, the result ended up being a lot more nuanced with what we're seeing now, where Android and Chrome OS have come together, but it's more that they're being aligned. They're two separate, distinct operating systems that overlap in a lot of ways, that share features, that have become much more visually similar over the years, but it's not the black and white extreme. And so in reading about Fuchsia, I can't help but be struck just by that same possibility that we're all jumping to the conclusion that it's a black and white, this is going to replace Android, this is going to replace Chrome OS kind of thing. And the Bloomberg report certainly suggests that, but it does it in a way that also leaves that wiggle room, that this is what the engineers working on it now are thinking about, and that it could, you know, the language they use, we'd have to go back and pull it up, but the language they use doesn't, it does leave that room for you to say, and how would it evolve? And then they also make sure to point out that, you know, neither the CEO of Google nor Hiroshi Lockheimer, the head of Android, has signed off on any kind of roadmap yet. So to be determined exactly how it would be implemented and how it would affect things. You've just got to think Android is such an enormous ecosystem nowadays with so many hardware partners and players involved, and Chrome OS is pretty massive too. And, you know, both on the personal front and even more so on the education front, and increasingly even on the enterprise front, there are a lot of companies, organizations, schools, businesses that rely on it. It seems like a very strange thing for Google to abandon these two giant, well-established brands and ecosystems for something new, and to assume that all of these people are going to come over, both on the, you know, hardware side and the user side. So I just can't help but wonder if perhaps there's some more gray area middle ground, that perhaps some parts of Fuchsia could replace parts of Android and or Chrome OS, but, you know, to the user from the outside, it would still be Android. It might still look like Android and function like Android, you know, however Android might evolve between now and then, but might be more of sort of a rebuilding of the foundation as opposed to a replacing with something new altogether, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. What comes to mind is maybe, you know, when Samsung was doing their whole Tizen thing, and they still have Tizen devices, but that was the question that always came up was, oh no, Samsung's going to replace Android with Tizen operating system on the phones. And they may have dabbled a little bit here and there, but Tizen found its home in other ways. And, you know, Samsung still relies on Android for its smartphones. So maybe Fuchsia has a home. We just haven't seen it. It hasn't been built yet.
Yeah, and you never know. I mean, it's Google. Google does weird things that we could be completely wrong, and maybe it is going to throw, you know, all these years of building up these brands and ecosystems out the window for something new. It's certainly possible, but it just seems like a much more sensible explanation, we'd say, for Fuchsia to kind of be merged in as part of, you know, one or more operating system, or to have a role as opposed to completely replacing it. It'll really be interesting to see how it plays out, because it's this sort of ongoing story that no one really ever knows much about, but there's always just enough to make you say, I wonder what the deal is with that.
Things that make you go, JR Raphael from AndroidIntel.net. JR, it's great getting you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to see you guys.
Absolutely. Good to see you too. We'll talk to you soon.
And finally, tonight, the Future of Life Institute has published a pledge signed by 2,600 AI researchers who promise never to create killer robots or to help anyone else create killer robots. Elon Musk, Alphabet's DeepMind, Berkeley professor Stuart Russell, and others have all agreed to participate in the have agreed not to participate. Sorry, I misspoke there.
When I said they agreed to participate in the development of lethal autonomous weapons, I meant to say that they did not.
To participate in the development of lethal autonomous weapons. And they say that the decision to take human life should never be delegated to a machine.
Hear, hear. Although, as we know, this is technology. Technology is often known to have unintended consequences. I wonder in executing, no pun intended, this plan, where that goes. Does that explicitly say, I will not build a robot that has a gun that will kill people, but I will build the brains that will power our future robots? And then what is the next step of those brains when somebody else comes along and says, hey, I can take those brains and I can put them in a robot that will kill someone? They have still participated. And I don't know where that line is drawn. I realize it's kind of nebulous, but how do you ever truly know, I guess, is my question.
And I mean, I think this problem isn't a new one. You know, we've had drones for a really long time, and they're, people, we just created them without really coming up with this sort of let's sign on to this pledge. Right. And so I think it's kudos to them to just starting somewhere. Yeah. I'm not going to create an autonomous killing machine. Well, thank you.
Yeah, that's really nice of you to not create that killing machine. But there's always someone that's going to want to create a killing machine.
Right. Well, and then there's like what you said, the brains. I mean, that's what's been going on with Google with the Maven project and people, objecting to being involved in that at all. And I mean, but then there's the self-driving car. Like we all know of the trolley problem. Like, what are you going to hit? A criminal who's about to go to jail, or a basket of puppies? Like, you hit the criminal, of course. Like, who makes that decision? Right. A robot or a person? So, just unintended consequences. And I mean, we're giving a lot of choices to our technology. So this is a good place to start.
That's a good way to look at it. I would agree with that. Tech News Weekly records live every Thursday starting at 2:30 p.m. Pacific, 5:30 p.m. Eastern. If you want to catch it live, you can do so by going to twit.tv/live. And you can also be part of the show if you want to. We don't get very many emails for this show, but if you'd like to email us, tnw@twit.tv, you can be part of the show and we'll read it on the show.
And go to your podcast player and subscribe to our show. Maybe you watch us live. Maybe you just tune in on YouTube occasionally. Maybe you just found us in a Google search.
Oh, hello.
And if you're here now till the very end, that means you like us. So subscribe, twit.tv/TNW, or maybe you hate watch us. I don't know. Either way is fine as long as you subscribe.
Right. We got your view.
And if you are hate watching our show, I want to know about it. Tweet at me at Megan Maroney.
And then Megan will tell me about it. But if you really want to tweet that at me as well, you can. I'm at Jason Howell. Thanks to Josh. Thanks to Burke, Jammer B, Colleen, everybody who helps here in the studio each and every day produce this show. We really appreciate it. And thanks to you for checking it out once more. And we'll see you next week on another episode of Tech News Weekly. Bye, everybody.